Out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session.
In a tale that sounds like the musical version of Batman meeting Aquaman, Sir Paul McCartney's love affair with the Beach Boys was less rivalry and more a nerdy bromance wrapped in harmony and sunshine. Although the media painted the Beatles and the Beach Boys as two gangs in a musical turf war during the 1960s, Paul was actually geeking out over their harmonies like a teenager discovering auto-tune for the first time. It all started in 1963, right when Beatlemania was hitting its maximum caffeine level, and Paul first heard the Beach Boys' silky smooth blend of harmonies. It was like his ears had just discovered dessert. According to Beatles insider Tony Barrow, Paul kept playing Surfin' USA like it was a coded message from heaven, dissecting every vocal arrangement with the intensity of a mad scientist trying to clone Brian Wilson in his basement. But the love fest hit its creative climax in 1966 when Brian Wilson dropped the legendary Pet Sounds, a sonic masterpiece that inspired the Beatles to up the ante with SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul allegedly played God Only Knows over 100 times in a row, probably making his record player beg for mercy. He even declared it the greatest song ever written, and if you think that's exaggeration, just ask the rest of us who have cried into our cereal bowls while listening to it. The Beach Boys didn't just impress Paul, they ignited a wave of creative competition that nearly drowned Brian Wilson in perfectionism. Wilson reportedly suffered a breakdown while working on the never-finished Smile album after SGT. Pepper took the world by storm. Paul, the sensitive musical knight that he is, felt genuinely bad about this, even telling his assistant he sometimes wondered if their friendly showdown accidentally broke Brian's musical spirit. But like any great superhero origin story, out of heartbreak came legacy. The Beach Boys' intricate harmonies didn't just inspire because on Abbey Road, they also left their fingerprints all over Paul's later work with Wings. So while it may have started as a beachy flirtation with falsetto, it blossomed into one of the most melodically respectful bromances in music history. And let's be honest, without those California boys singing about surfing in cars, we might have missed out on Paul McCartney's obsession with layered harmonies and emotional bass lines. No pressure, Brian, but you basically helped invent Paul's post-Beatles sound, just without the bowl cut and British accent. Before Paul McCartney was knighted by the Queen or became a global icon with enough awards to tile the Buckingham Palace floor, he was just a kid in Liverpool trying to scream like a man who sounded like he'd swallowed a firecracker, Little Richard. And let's be clear, this wasn't just admiration, it was full-blown musical worship, the kind where teenage Paul would basically shred his own throat imitating Little Richard's vocal thunder. While most kids were practicing guitar chords or trying not to fail math, Paul was busy perfecting that wild, untamed scream that would later become his signature secret weapon on Beatles tracks like I'm Down and Oh, Darling. McCartney once said he practiced Little Richard's vocals until my throat was raw, and you can bet that wasn't just poetic license. The man literally sacrificed his voice to the rock and roll gods. But the fanboy fantasy became reality in Hamburg, Germany in 1962, when the Beatles shared the stage with the flamboyant legend himself. Paul was so nervous to meet his idol that he nearly tossed his crumpets backstage. True story, according to Beatles historians. But instead of brushing off the young Liverpudlian, Little Richard took Paul under his wing and showed him how to play piano like he was punching an ex who owed him money. If you're gonna play rock and roll, honey, you gotta hit those keys like you're punching your worst enemy, Richard reportedly told him, and honestly, that's better advice than most motivational posters. The gospel-turned-rock vocal style, the sweat-dripping energy, and that vocal acrobatics clinic called a scream became part of Paul's DNA, not just as a vocalist, but as a performer who could turn emotional chaos into melody. McCartney didn't just mimic Richard, he internalized him. You can hear it in Maybe I'm Amazed when Paul's voice sounds like it's fighting through heartbreak, whiskey, and a thunderstorm all at once. It's theatrical, raw, and oh so Richard. Even later in life, McCartney credited Little Richard for giving him permission to be loud, loose, and a little bit unhinged on stage. And let's not forget that scream, it wasn't just noise, it was rebellion dressed in rhythm. If the Beatles were the world's greatest musical revolutionaries, then Little Richard was the guy who handed Paul the megaphone and said, "Now scream, baby." So while others gave Paul melody, style, or harmony, Richard gave him fire. And in the music world, that's like gifting someone the nuclear launch codes of stage presence. Before McCartney and Lennon became the peanut butter and jam of 1960s harmony, they were just two mop-top dreamers in Liverpool, desperately trying to sound like the Everly Brothers. Aka the vocal wizards who could blend their voices so smoothly they made barbershop quartets sound like arguing pigeons. Paul's admiration for Don and Phil Everly was not just casual appreciation, it bordered on vocal stalking. According to Paul himself, when he and John first started harmonizing, they didn't even pretend to be original. They straight up said, "We were the Everlys, mate." And they weren't kidding. Teenage Paul would spend entire weekends glued to his portable record player, playing Bye Bye Love and wake up little Susie on a loop like a lovesick puppy, studying every vocal flicker and harmonic shimmer with the dedication of a monk decoding ancient scrolls. He reportedly became obsessed with the way the brothers' voices seemed to vibrate at exactly the same frequency, creating what fans lovingly call that Everly shimmer, but what scientists might call a sonic love potion. It wasn't just a phase, it was a foundational obsession. When the Beatles first recorded at Abbey Road, Paul allegedly told George Martin that he and John had spent 2 full years rehearsing Everly-style harmonies before daring to hit the record button. That's like training for the Olympics just to nail a karaoke night. And their early Beatles hits, tracks like Please Please Me and From Me to You are dripping with Everly DNA like harmony-filled fan letters set to a Mercebeat drumline. But this wasn't just a musical crush, it was personal. When fame came knocking at the Beatles' door and the world turned into a screaming blur of photographers and panic, Paul reportedly reached out to Don Everly for advice on how to stay sane amid the chaos. And Don, being the chill harmony Jedi that he was, offered Paul some deep-fried wisdom on staying true to the art even when the money starts raining down like confetti. That advice stuck with Paul like super glue. He carried it through Beatlemania, through Wings, and even into his solo work like a lyrical compass pointing toward integrity. In the end, the Everly brothers didn't just give Paul a musical blueprint, they gave him a philosophy. Their harmonies became his happy place, their resilience his roadmap, and their shimmering vocal blend his personal gold standard. So the next time you hear Paul's silky voice bouncing off another Beatle harmony, remember, those aren't just notes, they're Everly love letters dressed in British accents. When Paul McCartney first heard Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven blasting from a Liverpool record shop, it wasn't just a catchy tune to him. It was like hearing the gospel of rock and roll for the first time, only with more duck walking and less choir robes. This wasn't just admiration from afar, this was the kind of creative crush that made Paul treat Chuck's lyrics like sacred scripture. According to Paul's childhood mate Ivan Vaughan, young McCartney was so mesmerized by Berry's precision and wordplay that he literally transcribed Chuck's lyrics into a notebook by hand like he was prepping for a final exam in rock poetry. Berry's storytelling style, compact, vivid, and bursting with personality, inspired Paul to write songs that were more than just melodies. They were little worlds. Without Chuck there'd be no Alina Rigby dragging her lonely rice down a church aisle or Penny Lane turning a barbershop into a Technicolor dream. Berry wasn't just an influence, he was the prototype for McCartney's musical storytelling, giving Paul the green light to turn mundane British life into magical pop novellas. And it wasn't just the lyrics that Berry beamed into Paul's DNA. Chuck's signature rhythmic drive laid the foundation for Paul's revolutionary approach to bass playing. While most bassists were just keeping time like a polite metronome, McCartney started writing countermelodies on the bass like he was dueling the lead guitar in a spaghetti western. Critics and musicians alike have noted how Paul's bass lines often dance with the vocals, echoing Berry's own rhythmic inventions on guitar. And when the two finally met in 1972 backstage at a London concert, it wasn't exactly a smooth handshake and smile scenario. At first, Chuck reportedly mistook Paul for just another British invasion guy, ouch. But that changed fast when McCartney casually started reciting lyrics from Berry's deeper catalog like a human jukebox with an accent. Chuck, visibly touched, reportedly told his manager that Beatle knows my songs better than I do, which is basically the musical equivalent of being knighted. The respect was mutual and monumental. Paul once said in an interview, Chuck Berry is the only one I'd admit might be better than me at telling a story through song. And for a guy with a catalog longer than a CVS receipt, that's saying something. Chuck Berry didn't just teach McCartney how to rock, he taught him how to narrate, how to groove, and how to turn life's little details into timeless anthems. So if you've ever sung along to She's Leaving Home and felt like you knew every character, every teardrop, and every detail of that fictional universe, it's because Chuck Berry handed Paul the blueprint and said, "Now go build your own musical planet, kid." Elvis Presley, the swagger that shook Paul to his core. Before Paul McCartney ever stepped foot on an international stage or became the left-handed Beatle with a smile worth 1,000,000 vinyls, he was just a 14-year-old Liverpool lad who got spiritually karate-chopped by the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. It was 1956, and when young Paul heard Heartbreak Hotel for the first time, the effect was less like hearing a hit song and more like being zapped by a musical lightning bolt wearing rhinestones. According to McCartney, he was so stunned he couldn't speak for an hour. That's right, Sir Paul, who later sang in over 1,000 performances, was literally rendered mute by the raw power of Elvis's voice. His friend Billy Kinsley remembers Paul showing up to school the next day with his hair slicked back and his lip trying desperately to curl like Presley's, like a kid who didn't just want to like Elvis, but wanted to be Elvis, sideburns and all. But this wasn't just a schoolboy crush, it was the spark that lit Paul's entire career. Before Elvis, Paul was focused on playing instruments like a polite choir boy with big dreams. After Elvis, he realized that stage presence wasn't optional, it was the entire show. Presley's swagger, hip-shaking bravado, and mysterious charisma taught Paul that being a rock star wasn't just about hitting notes, it was about hypnotizing the room while doing it. And then came the moment of all moments. In 1965, the Beatles finally met Elvis at his Bel Air home. This should have been Paul's chance to dazzle his idol with wit and charm, right? Nope. According to Beatles assistant Tony Barrow, Paul was so starstruck he couldn't do anything except nod like a bobblehead on overdrive and repeatedly mumble the word gear. For a man known for charming crowds of screaming fans, this was the ultimate musical malfunction. But even that awkward encounter cemented Presley as more than just an influence. He was a living legend in Paul's universe. McCartney later said, "Elvis is why I do what I do," which is basically the rock and roll version of saying I pledge allegiance to the pelvis. Elvis didn't just influence Paul's vocals or performance style, he transformed the way Paul saw fame, charisma, and what it meant to completely own a room. Presley was proof that you could be dangerous and delightful at the same time, and Paul absorbed that lesson like a sponge in leather pants. So while other artists may have shaped Paul's sound or style, Elvis shaped his aura. And honestly, if McCartney ever starts doing high kicks and karate poses in concert, don't be surprised. It's just the ghost of Elvis whispering, "Thank you very much" from the rock and roll afterlife. Buddy Holly and the Crickets, the blueprint that birthed the Beatles. If Elvis was the spark that lit the fuse, then Buddy Holly was the entire instruction manual for Paul McCartney's musical rocket ship. And unlike other influences who gave Paul a nudge or a note or a catchy harmony, Buddy Holly basically gave him the entire starter pack for being in a band. From the horn-rimmed glasses to the songwriting style to the actual name, the Beatles, a nod to Holly's band, the Crickets, Holly's fingerprints are all over McCartney's musical DNA like glitter you can't get off after a craft night. It all began on Paul's 15th birthday in 1957 when he heard That'll Be the Day, and according to his brother Mike McCartney, Paul played that record so many times it nearly disintegrated into vinyl dust. But he wasn't just listening, he was studying. Holly didn't just sing songs, he wrote them, played lead guitar, and led the band, essentially being the first do-it-yourself rock star before it was cool to slap that label on your Spotify bio. Paul was mesmerized. He told biographer Barry Miles that what blew his mind was how Buddy was the full package, a musical Swiss Army knife in a pair of nerdy glasses. So inspired was Paul that during the Beatles' Hamburg days, he even adopted Holly's signature look, wearing thick-rimmed specs like he was trying to see music through Buddy's eyes. And in a plot twist worthy of a rock opera, Paul eventually purchased the entire Buddy Holly song catalog in 1976, not to make a financial killing, but to protect the songs like they were sacred heirlooms. "I felt I owed him that," Paul allegedly said, "and if that doesn't make your musical heart grow 3 sizes, you might be made of tambourine parts." The homage didn't stop there. McCartney's musical structure, those tight, hook-driven Beatles tunes that seem to float yet punch, carry Buddy Holly's rhythmic sensibilities and melodic phrasing in every measure. Even the Beatles' early song arrangements, stage presence, and stripped-down guitar bass drums lineup were lifted straight from Holly's playbook. It was like Holly built the mold, and Paul just filled it with Liverpool swagger and a few extra yeah-yeah-yeahs. And while others gave Paul individual tools, Holly gave him the blueprint. If music were a religion, Buddy Holly would be the patron saint of Paul's creative cathedral. So while Buddy's life was tragically cut short, his influence lived on through McCartney, whose career became a lifelong tribute to the man who taught him that rock stars could wear glasses, write their own songs, and still melt faces. Without Buddy Holly, there wouldn't be a Beatlemania. And without Beatlemania, well, let's just say YouTube reaction channels would be 70% less emotional content. 7. Conclusion: even legends have musical heroes. So there you have it, folks. Behind Sir Paul McCartney's jaw-dropping discography, his nightly swagger, and his seemingly bottomless pit of melodies, lies a humble music nerd who once fangirled so hard he lost his voice imitating Little Richard and forgot how to talk when Elvis walked into the room. Each of these 6 musical icons, the Beach Boys, Little Richard, the Everly Brothers, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and Buddy Holly, not only influenced McCartney's sound, but shaped his entire identity as a performer, songwriter, and sonic risk-taker. It's almost poetic that a man who inspired generations was himself a mosaic of other legends' legacies. From mimicking the Everly Brothers' vocal shimmer to dissecting Brian Wilson's harmonies like a mad scientist with a surfboard, Paul's musical journey proves that even the greatest composers are built on borrowed magic. And let's be honest, how refreshing is it to know that even a Beatle geeked out over someone else's chord progression? McCartney didn't just honor his idols with words. He embedded them into his art, his attitude, and even his business decisions, like buying Buddy Holly's catalog to protect it like a vault full of platinum records. So the next time you find yourself humming Penny Lane or air drumming to Maybe I'm Amazed, remember, somewhere in those notes, echoes of Holly's glasses, Richard's screams, and Chuck Berry's lyrical wizardry are still rocking out, forever etched into the soul of the world's most melodic Beatle. Because even legends like Paul McCartney stand on the shoulders of giants, some barefoot, some bejeweled, and all absolutely unforgettable.